everyone, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 19th, where I wanted to talk a little bit about Invasion of the Body Snatchers and also discuss quotation a little bit, since last class we were talking about writing papers, and also move to our next film, the very iconic Psycho. And this is where I cheated because I will have two films that represent the 1960s, the first being Psycho and the second being Night of the Living Dead. But the 60s were a very tumultuous time in our society, so I would argue that perhaps the decade of the 1960s deserves two films. Well, as you know, we watched Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is a good example of genre blending. And while it does have elements of horror, it also has elements of science fiction. It's based, as I had indicated last class, on a science fiction novel by Jack Finney. And know how many of these films are originally based in novels. It's filmed in a very film noir style, so much like what we were talking about with Cat People, you can see a nice use of the black and white in the film. In 1994, Invasion of the Body Snatchers was preserved in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. This is something that we've also talked about for films such as Dracula. So some of the ways that they help to promote the film, they use these paper mache props of some of the alien pods in the lobby theater. It was a financially successful film, though it had mixed reviews. And as some of you indicated in your discussion forum responses, it originally had a different ending. It was supposed to end with Miles in the highway basically pleading for help with no one paying attention to him. Test audiences didn't like that bleak ending, so they added the frame where ultimately it seems that law enforcement can come and save the day, or at least that's the somewhat hopeful note that we end with. That highway scene always strikes me as being so suggestive. The idea that Miles is trying to take the highway or the proper way. As you indicated in your discussion forum questions, this film is most read as a political commentary on the invading force of communism. So the 1950s was definitely a time of paranoia, and I think that you can get that sense in watching Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I've often talked about Invasion of the Body Snatchers being in reference to any kind of invasion at all. Not only the idea of space aliens, because there was a crash in Roswell, New Mexico in 1948 that was supposedly a flying saucer, so there was concerns about that, but anyone or anything that could be considered to be other. And I always think about the idyllic town that Invasion of the Body Snatchers takes place in, Santa Mira. And Mira in Spanish means look. And the idea is that the film is asking us to look and see. But despite the fact that they live in this seemingly idyllic town, they're still able to be invaded by an alien or other force. But more than anything, going back to the idea of Miles on the highway pleading for help, the assumption is that most of the people driving on the highway are probably not pod people, but are probably humans. And note that they lack humanity in the sense that no one stops to help Miles. So the question of what is human and what is inhuman, I think, is embedded within in the story. And I use the term pod people. So if you've ever heard that term before, it comes from this particular film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where we have science fiction. Some have suggested that that's the danger of a closed mind, as opposed to just horror, which is the dread of knowing. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but I do think that science fiction talks about the uncertainties of the future world as opposed to horror and gothic, which oftentimes talks about the legacies of the past. So, just to give you a sense of what was going on in the 1950s, concerns about the atom bomb and the possibility of apocalypse, a World War III. And this was the beginnings of the early Cold War. And that's where much of the fear of invasion and immigration stemmed from, whether it be political invasion and political immigration, or whether it be ethnic or some combination thereof. And the idea of the suburbs was supposed to be a place of refuge. You might have heard the term white flight, where many Caucasian individuals fled from the cities to move into the suburbs because the cities, from their perspective, were being overcome by that which was alien or different. Usually that was categorized as ethnic minorities. And the home, although it was supposed to be a refuge, ended up becoming a kind of prison. So not only did the suburbs not provide safety, but they also provided this sense of entrapment. And this is something that we will definitely be seeing in Psycho. If you look in the notes below, you'll see that I have a few links for some pictures that I wanted you to look at from the film. The first is about the Suburban Flight, and the first picture that I had highlighted shows very much that idyllic concept of the suburbs, right down to someone mowing their lawn and trying to tame the natural world. And of course, the natural world cannot be tamed. Some have even suggested that television in the suburbs became our new kind of electronic hearth with the flickering of images. And some have said that this is comparable now with computers and cell phones. Another image that I wanted you to take a look at was the town common street, where you can see stop very clearly on the pavement. And this is when all of the townspeople are beginning to meet so that they can find a way to distribute the pods to neighboring locales. And the stop sign, or the stop word, I should say, on the pavement, I think it is very clearly indicative of what we should do, which is stop this alien invasion from happening. I don't think it's any mistake that this occurs when people fall asleep. We saw an idea like this with Cesar when we were talking about in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the idea that we need to wake up to the dangers that are around us, whether it be a communist threat, communism planting the seeds of a different kind of political ideology that stands against personal liberty and results in dehumanization. But of course, as I had indicated with Miles on the Highway, I think perhaps those individuals have already been dehumanized if they can so easily ignore a very obviously troubled man pleading for help on the highway. And we've talked a little bit about the idea of double in our previous films, and we see that again in this film with doppelganger, whether that be our emotionless double, or the idea that the monstrosity can be our family, can be our friends, can be ourselves. No place is safe. And keep this in mind when you are watching Psycho, that no place, not even the shower, is safe. The sense of the uncanny, which I believe that we've talked about earlier in the semester, this idea from Freud, that which seems disorienting because it's quite similar to human features, but not exactly like a human. And that would be represented by these pod people who are identified as being almost exact doubles, but not quite. Dr. Miles Bennell, we know, is a man of science, and he's divorced. And that would be somewhat unusual for the time period. Becky Driscoll, our female lead, is also divorced. And again, that would be somewhat unusual for the time period. It always struck me as how flirtatious the two of them are, how sexually open the both of them are, particularly after we've seen a film of sexual repression such as Cat People. And there really isn't that much distance between the two films in terms of time. Becky Driscoll's wardrobe, that strapless dress that she wears, I think is quite suggestive of sexual innuendo. And again, if you look in the notes below, you'll see that I have a picture captured of her wearing that particular dress that shows a good amount of cleavage. Note that she is the one who dies at the ending of the film, or is transformed, and Miles isn't, even though both of them are divorced, which again I think is oftentimes seen as commentary in film. Definitely we'll talk about this in Halloween, about the standards that female is supposed to uphold in terms of purity, if we wanted to read the film from that particular lens. My favorite quote from the film, or perhaps I should say one of my favorite quotes from the film, is that what's happening is being caused by, quote, mass hysteria, caused by worry of what's going on in the world, unquote. And I think that that's an applicable quote for all of the films that we are viewing this particular semester. But we do see a general dehumanization in this film, and this allegory, or this symbolic tale of the dangers of communism and McCarthyism, which very much was a time of paranoia, of identifying family and friends as being communist sympathizers. That post-war paranoia of what are the possibilities of apocalypse, and what are the possibilities of a Cold War turning into a hot war, and just the general loss of humanity and individuality that I think could be a commentary about the way that the direction of the United States was seen by some individuals. Now, you'll remember that last class I had talked a little bit about writing papers, in that we will ultimately have a final project at the ending of the semester. And while you're free to do a creative work, I suspect that many of you would write a traditional academic paper. So I discussed some resources that could be helpful to you, such as Purdue OWL, for instance, or even the GCC library, which has links for writing papers. I wanted to very briefly talk about quotation as well, and that there are some conventions with quotation, and of course you can look these up in Purdue OWL or the GCC library as well. But if you, and you can see this in the notes below, if you ever wanted to omit something inside of a quote, it's known as an ellipsis, and what you would do is use 3 periods or 3 dots, and you get to decide when to start and end the quote, but in between that starting and ending point, and you can start a quote in mid-sentence, and you can end the quote in mid-sentence. But between that starting and ending point, if you were to leave out something, a word or words, not because you want to change the meaning, but purely because it just isn't relevant, then you would use the ellipsis. Those 3 periods or dots would let the reader know that the original text had additional content that you left out. Likewise, you can also add in your language inside of a quote. A quote is supposed to be the exact word for word documentation of what somebody had said. Now, you wouldn't be commenting on the quote within the quote, because you can comment on the relevance of the quote after the quote. However, if you felt that you needed to interrupt the quote to perhaps clarify something that was unclear, what you would do is use a square bracket, not a parentheses, a square bracket. You might have seen this in quotes as well. And whenever you see a square bracket within a quote, that's your language that you're adding in. Oftentimes it's done for pronouns in order to clarify. So you might have a pronoun that says he, for instance, but it could be in reference to either Dr. Caligari or Cesar. So in this instance, in the square brackets, you added in the name Cesar, so you could clearly denote that the he was in reference to Cesar. But the word Cesar never appeared in the original quote. A block quote, if you have generally over 3 lines of text, not 3 sentences, but over 3 lines of text, you want to be able to format it in such a way so that it can be easily seen where the quote begins and, more importantly, ends. Usually we use quotation marks to indicate that, but if we've got a very long quote, it would be difficult to find the closing quote marks. So what we do is we block off the text, and basically usually that means indenting on both sides so that it appears as a block of text. And again, you can see examples of this on the GCC library website and also Purdue OWL, and I'm hopeful that this is a review for you based on what you would have discussed in your English classes, but I just wanted to briefly review it. And finally, documentation, and that what we use in the humanities, and that includes classes such as communications or interpersonal communications or any languages, that would mean using the MLA or Modern Language Association system, which is based on using parentheses. It's known as parenthetical documentation, where basically at the ending of the quote, and it doesn't matter whether your quote is completed and you're ready to end your sentence or you want to continue your sentence and comment on that quote, But immediately after the quote, what you do is you put a parentheses. And within that parentheses, you would put the least amount of information necessary for the reader to be able to identify the location of that quote. Usually it's a page number from a text. And you don't have to write the word P or PAGE or PG, just the number, just the numeral. And if it turns out that it's unclear which text you are referencing, then you probably need to add additional information in addition to the page number. In this instance, probably it would be the author's last name and then the page number. If you've got multiple texts that you are citing or quoting from by the same author, you might actually have to include part of the title. And the way the system works is that you try to keep it as simplified as possible, and you identify within the quotations, or you identify within the parentheses, the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to determine where that information is coming from. And the way all of this works, as I suspect you already know, is there is included a works cited page at the ending of the paper. And this lists all of the works that were cited or quoted within the paper. And they are all listed in alphabetical order by author's last name. And there's slightly different conventions for how you would indicate a book as opposed to a magazine, as opposed to a website, and so forth and so on. So you just basically follow that criteria. And oftentimes it's very nitpicky about where you put punctuation and so forth. And then that is the information that a reader would need in order to be able to find the original source so that they could verify the veracity of your quote. So that's the way the whole system works in its entirety, so that you don't have to keep repeating over and over again within the body of the paper where your source came from. You just include in parentheses after the quote the least amount of information for a reader to be able to identify the original source, and then at the very ending of the paper, you list all of your sources. And I'm not sure whether or not you are going to be using outside sources, such as some of the information from the textbooks I ordered in class. You may just be doing purely a film analysis. And in that instance, you would, if you chose to, be quoting dialogue from the film, but you wouldn't necessarily be quoting an outside source. But I wanted to briefly review all of this, and again, remind you that you can find this on Purdue OWL, you can find this on the JCC website. You can always ask me questions as well. And I'm hopeful that, again, this is something that's a review that you would have done in your English 101 class, and probably other courses as well. Which leads us to Psycho, which is a fairly long film compared to some of the other films that we've seen. It's 1 hour and 49 minutes. So I was fortunate enough to be able to find a free version online. We're getting to the point in the semester where it's becoming more difficult to be able to find free versions. But at this point, thus far, we've been fine. And the good news with Night of the Living Dead is that there are plenty of free versions online. We'll talk about some of the reasons why next class. But Psycho 2 was based on a book by Robert Bloch, which was very loosely based on the Ed Gein murders, which you might have heard of before, that involved cannibalizing women. And I can say that both stories, the novel as well as the film, talk about violence against women. Psycho, from Alfred Hitchcock, has become iconic. So it's not just necessarily the story, but the filmmaking techniques. And in some ways, it reminds me of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in terms of filmmaking, but obviously much more contemporary, much more advanced. You may have heard of the shower scene in Psycho. If you haven't, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but there will be a character in the shower who will be attacked. That's all I'm going to say. As soon as you see it, you'll understand. And that's going to be our attendance question for today. That will be due on the 21st, which is Friday at 6 p.m. Though certainly, if you need an extension, let me know. And it's, why do you think the shower scene is so iconic in Psycho, and why? And it is. It's probably one of the best known scenes ever filmed in any kind of film, but certainly horror film. So after you've seen it, and you may have already seen it before, and we've talked about how with these films, they merit multiple reviewings and multiple viewings and reviewings because of the way that we want to analyze these films in depth. But if you've never seen the shower scene before, I suspect that you might be somewhat surprised. And if you have seen the shower scene before, I asked you to reflect on why do you think it is so iconic. And now, based on what we've talked about thus far over the course of the semester. And next class, I'll talk more about Psycho. So I hope you're doing well, I'm doing well, and enjoy Psycho. Take care. Bye-bye.